Good afternoon, and welcome to Life Along the Merrimack. This is Dyke Hendrickson, host of the weekly show, and we're here to talk about the health and history of the Merrimack River. We are heard on 96.3 FM radio, on cable TV, cablecast, and we're archived on YouTube. I am the outreach historian for the Custom House Maritime Museum here in Newburyport, and my goal is to bring history to the community. Our guest is theoretically today Frank Cousins, who heads the Greater Chamber of Commerce here in Newburyport. He is not here, so I think I will start the interview without him. Now, this has a downside for Frank, since I am answering the questions that I was going to ask him. And then I want to talk a little about the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard was founded in Newburyport, as I think some folks might know. I have just finished a book about the Coast Guard, and I'm thus ebullient. And I'm going to go over some things about the founding of the Coast Guard here in Newburyport. So one of the things I was going to ask Frank is, he's the head of the Chamber of Commerce here in Newburyport. And so I was going to say, Frank, what is your assessment of the recent buying season in town? Did the stores and restaurants do pretty well? Okay, I will answer that question. They did pretty well. There were a lot of people downtown. There wasn't a lot of snow. It wasn't that cold. And the restaurants I were in were quite busy. We do have a couple changes in the downtown. Dos Amigos, the restaurant on Pleasant Street, is gone. So is the Thai Lily, which is, you can't call it a new Thai restaurant. It was there throughout the summer, but it has also departed. I don't know who's entering then. One of the things about Newburyport is, from October through March, it's a difficult life in terms of getting people into the restaurants. And there are about 30 restaurants here in Newburyport alone, and for a town of 18,000, that's quite a few restaurants. So those two seem to have gone down. The one I'm waiting for is someone to fill up the old Black Cow on the riverfront. There is a Black Cow, of course, on the street now. It moved, but there will be a restaurant in the Black Cow on the water, I understand. That was one of my favorite restaurants. It was funny. I was a journalist for a long time here in Newburyport, and about every 6 months I would call up Legal Seafoods. That's a chain of seafood restaurants in Boston and other communities, and I'd say, geez, are you folks moving in? The rumor is that you're going to move into the Black Cow vacancy. And so I seemed to get the same PR woman towards the end, and she said, is this you again? Well, I told you, 3 months ago, we're not moving in. We don't have any plans. And so you're just wasting a phone call. Still, I kept at it, and the answer seems to be no, they're not moving in. Another question for Frank, is the new parking garage doing well? You know that it's in a downtown on Merrimack Street. It's been open perhaps 6 to 8 months. There are varying reports on this, I must say. The Daily News had one story, yes, this is doing great. And the next day, it said, well, it's not doing as well as it could be. Now, that was a counselor, a city councilor, who evidently called the paper and said, your story did not quite add into the fact you have to pay for the land upon which it sits. So that's a much greater expense. So it seems like the parking garage is doing pretty well, but it's because it has significant expenses, including, buying the land, it's not doing quite as well. And so in terms of the Chamber of Commerce, one of the areas that's doing quite well is down by the Route 1 Rotary. There's 6 to 8 new stores in there, restaurants. The restaurant near the courthouse has been revamped and is now open. There are other stores, including the flower shop, that are on the Rotary. If you can get in and out of there without being killed, it's a beautiful thing. But so it looks like that those have filled up well, and it seems to be successful. Also in that area, the units are going in for apartments right next to the T station. That used to be a parking lot. I used to park there. when I worked at Mass General down in Boston, took the train every day. They're going to have 80 units there of rental. They're about 10 to 12% is affordable rentals. That does not mean low income. It means affordable. So those are going up as we speak. It may help Metsy's out, that's the restaurant, in the next parking lot. So that's a development that's happening. Other things, on Low Street, there are about 15 houses going in the old farm, the Colby Farm, which is across from the tennis club. I know the tennis club because I've been a member there for several decades. And there are about 15 single-family houses there. And I have no idea when they're going to be moving forward. It was going to be a dog park, and until it was said that several nearby residents complained about the proposed dog park. Now, there are only 2 or 3 houses right there, so they must have very persuasive voices, because all of a sudden, no dog park. And, later, of course, real estate interests bought it. And as I understand it, they're going to about 15 houses. So those are some of the developments taking place. One of the variables also for the economy of the town, and we're talking about that because the Chamber of Commerce is involved, is whether there will be expansion in the industrial park. That was started in the late 50s. It filled up. It's doing very well in general. Rochester Electronics is probably the largest tenant, and to my way of thinking, it must be the largest private employer in the town. Now, Anna Jakes employs about 1,000, but that's not really a profit-making enterprise. And the city of Newburyport, between the school system and other employees, also hires a great many people. But Rochester Electronics must be top on the list in terms of elements hiring the most people. So a couple of things also have happened about the river and the waterfront recently. Senator Bruce Tarr, who's a Republican from Gloucester, he does represent Newbury, though, and as we know, much of Plum Island is in Newbury. He made the comment recently at a meeting that he's concerned that folks down at Plum Island are putting boulders and rock formations along the ocean. It's their way of holding back erosion. But as was predicted about a year or two ago when they started doing this, they put big boulders there. They covered it with sand. But, as high tide comes along and the tempests occur, the sand is washed away. So we have a lot of boulders there. So and Bruce Tarr is a state senator. He's influential. Other city officials have also said people should not be putting boulders on the waterfront because, first of all, the state has not approved them, and secondly, they're not very effective. Now, there is a great desire to build and live on Plum Island. We know that. 2 or 3 very large houses have gone up in recent times near on Annapolis Drive, and they were exact same place where houses washed out several years ago. So it is a buyer beware situation, literally. They're large houses, they're expensive houses, and a lot of local banks, incidentally, will not loan to people building on this barrier island. But I suppose these people could pay without bank loans, and there are numerous residences going up on the Newbury side of Plum Island. And I must say it's a curious thing because Newbury, the town, famously is always seeking property tax revenue. And so they will, give permits, they'll dig into the dunes, they'll build right on the sand. And the Newburyport side, on the other hand, is quite concerned about holding on to the dunes. And frequently in the spring, classes from the middle school or high school come down and they plant seagrass or something like that. in hopes that it'll keep the sand. So it's curious, in the very same week, maybe the same day, you have backhoes in Newbury digging up the dunes and getting ready for houses. And in the Newburyport side, you have school kids just putting in dune grass with the hopes that they'll be able to save the dunes. So it's a little unusual, but much that's happening out there is unusual, because if you came from, a parallel universe, you might say, why do they keep building houses on parcels in which houses have disappeared before? Literally, I mean, you folks remember 3 or 4 years ago, houses, they were undercut, they were leaning, and some of them actually fell into the drink. So that is an unfortunate thing, but we'll see more about that. Now, I am fixated by the river these days because I recently signed a book contract to write a book titled Merrimack, the Resilient River. So I think this will be interesting. It'll go back into the history, the Native Americans, the settlers, the arrival of the mills in Lowell in about 1820, and that was the largest element of changing the river up until that time. There was a very large timber trade from the New Hampshire woods coming down, and the logs would float all the way down to Newburyport. And when they reached Newburyport, now we're talking 18th and early 19th century, there was a lot of shipbuilding going on. And so that was a great asset for Newburyport, that logs could float down. In about the 1820s, though, the technology change and hydropower was harnessed. And so captains of industry went to the Merrimack River, and they created hydropower plants that harnessed the power, and it created the opportunity to have factories run. You weren't paying for it, but the water was there. So they built dams, and then they built canals, and they changed a lot of the natural elements. I mention this, A, because I was in Lowell yesterday walking along the river, seeing where this had been done 2 centuries ago, and B, because I saw the book several weeks along the Concord and Merrimack Rivers by Ralph Waldo Emerson. And so he loved the Concord River. He paddled up. But then when he got to the Merrimack River, which is the Concord River runs into the Merrimack River in Lowell, he started seeing these large mills. Now, he wrote his book, A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. He wrote it in 1839. It was published, actually, in 1849. He published it himself, I might point out, and he's often joked, if you want a copy, I have about 900 of them in the back room of my house. So it was not a hot seller, but he was a little displeased with the way the river was changing. Anyway, so that was a big change. And things, Lawrence was built also to use the power of the Merrimack River in about 1840. Haverhill also benefited, as did Newburyport and Amesbury. So the river has been a big factor in our history. And one of the factors, in addition to the hydropower and the mills that really spawned the Industrial Revolution here in New England and the country, was it helped. The Merrimack River was the birthplace of the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard was found in 1790 along the river, and that's what I'd like to talk a little about today. The Coast Guard did start here, but many people don't know that. And I was at parties over the holiday season, and people, when I mentioned my interest in the river and in the Coast Guard, people say, gee, I heard it was the birthplace of the Coast Guard. And I said, that is true. And on my, podcast, Life Along the Merrimack, I try to bring that out frequently. So I'm going to read a little about the birthplace of the Coast Guard here in Newburyport. It comes from this grand text, which is Nautical Newburyport. A History of Captains, Clipper Ships, and the Coast Guard. I wrote this book a couple years ago, and I like the fact that there's a good history of the Coast Guard here. And so I'm going to just read a little bit. Again, this is Dyke Hendrickson, and the outreach historian for the Custom House Maritime Museum here in Newburyport. We were supposed to have a guest. We do not have that guest today, but we're heard on 96.3 FM. We are seen on cable TV, and we're on YouTube. So right now, I'm going to just read a little about the birthplace of the Coast Guard. Newburyport was declared the official birthplace of the Coast Guard in 1965. Other communities were vying for that honor, but this city was awarded the designation, in part because the first vessel to provide service here was built here, the Massachusetts. That was the first vessel. The Coast Guard wasn't so named until 1915. But Newburyport has had a centuries-long connection with two elements of the sea, shipbuilding and rescue operations. Its Coast Guard station on Water Street today represents its ongoing value to boaters and the local community. And it's a reminder that the Coast Guard is still providing support to mariners as it did many decades ago. The story goes that Alexander Hamilton was the Secretary of the Treasury in 1789. He went to George Washington, our president, and said, "We don't have any money. We're about $70 million in debt from the Revolution, and we need a plan for payment." And one way that he decided to generate money was to make sure that tariffs for all the shipping were being collected. And he wanted to stop smuggling because smugglers would come along, they'd drop off their cargo, and thus they wouldn't pay taxes on it. So the Revenue Act of 1789 made provision for such a tax. The tax was biased in that it was lower on goods from American ships. This helped the American merchant ships to gain a foothold in the shipping industry. U.S. shipping, again, this is 1790, had been compromised by losses in the war, and so Americans had lost not only ships, but their companies. Hamilton also proposed a lighthouse service that would help mariners to be careful for rocks and hazards. So there was a revenue cutter service started in 1790. There was a lighthouse service started a little later, and there was also a life-saving service. So all these three services started separately, but they were incorporated together in 1915. Hamilton knew quite a bit about trade. If you haven't seen the play, he was originally from the West Indies, where they did a lot of trade. And he was interested in making sure that that more money was collected and that people could not just drop off their goods. He started a revenue cutter service, and he ordered 10 vessels to be built. The first one was the Massachusetts. That was built here in Newburyport in 1790. 9 others were created, and they started collecting money. So the strategy of the builders at that time was to produce vessels that were fast and sleek. They weren't as large as many of the commercial vessels, but they were fast. They often had to operate in small harbors or in winding rivers, and that certainly sounds like Newburyport. Records show they could take almost any weather and get through it, and they can approach many vessels even though they were larger. About the Massachusetts, which, as we say, was the first vessel built, she has 1 deck and 2 masts. Her length is 50 feet above her upper deck. Her depth is 7 feet 8 inches. Her breadth is 17 feet 8 inches. She measures 70 tons. She's a square sail schooner, has an Indian's heads for a figurehead. She has a long quarter deck and a deep waist. And the Coast Guard historians have said that she carried 3 or 4 light swivel guns. During the decade of the 18th century, this fleet stood like our ersatz Navy, meaning we didn't actually have a Navy in 1790. In 1798 was our first naval ship, the Merrimack, also built in Newburyport. That's another story. But it did have these 10 revenue cutters. And the other vessel that was built in Newburyport, the revenue cutter, was the Pickering. And so 2 out of the first 10 vessels of the organization that would eventually become the Coast Guard were built here in Newburyport. And so here, the Pickering, for instance, was much larger. It carried close to 90 people and had 14 light guns. So it was built a little later than the Massachusetts, and because everything was evolving, they were able to do that. So besides revenue collection, the Coast Guard vessels were involved in enforcing quarantine restrictions by local, state, and federal authorities. And that's a big deal because, if, for instance, typhoid or diphtheria or tuberculosis started on a ship, you could have numerous seamen be very sick. And if they were let off in port, such as Newburyport, that spelled disaster. So one of the early Coast Guard duties, and this goes back to 1790 or so, was enforcing quarantine restrictions. They also went along Coast Guards to make sure the lighthouse stations were in order. We just said the lighthouse service started in about this time. Lighthouses were very important because many captains didn't know where the rocks were, didn't know where the disasters were about to happen, and the Coast Guard was helpful in this. And as things went on, more money was created, and it was successful. And a journal from a second mate gives a glimpse of a crewman's tenure on the ship, and this was 1791. It was quoted by a historian named Florence Kern in her 1796 study of the Massachusetts. And this is, again, a journal from about 1791. No revenue cutter in Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton's system of cutters saw shorter federal service than the first cutter named the Massachusetts, a 70-ton schooner built in Newburyport, as we have just said. It was one of the 10 armed vessels of the United States ordered to patrol the Atlantic coast to protect the revenue, and she was very costly, and eventually it was put to fallow. Well, you can't actually, that's a mixed metaphor, if not an oxymoron. You can't put a ship to fallow, that you put a field to fallow. But anyway, the Massachusetts had several years of life, and after that, it was a situation where it retired and they made a larger ship, and life went on. So one of the things that I thought was interesting was we've had, I think I'll take a break here, actually. I think our guest may be here. And so I'm going to take a break. This is Life Along the Merrimack, and I'm about to welcome Frank Cousins. Can you tell him to come in here? We were just going to take a short break. We usually don't, but we will. Now, Caroline, how much time would we have?
You have about 7 minutes.
What can it be extended or not?
I mean, that's not something I would say.
Frank,
we don't have them till 3.
Frank, can you come in?
We don't have Drew till 3, but I don't know if Sarah wants to.
Is she here?
I apologize for
That's
screwing up.
okay. That's okay. So we're not on now. Frank, could you sit over there?
Sure.
And so we're going to talk for about 10 or 15 minutes.
If you like, it's fine. I apologize.
Does that sound okay? Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So tell us when we're back on.
I taught today, the first day at school. And I got screwed up coming back from Lynn. I thought it was a Danvers, and I got back to the office. And said, oh, geez, I can't do these.
Okay, so I'm just going to ask you some basic questions. Carolyn, tell us when we're back on again.
Yeah, sure.
Do you have Frank's camera?
Yeah, I'll go on.
And then I have to put his mic on, correct?
Do you know how to put this?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, why don't you?
So we're going to be continuing our talking. We're just talking about the Coast Guard. Now we're going to talk to Frank Cousins, who is from the waterfront. He's the head of the local Chamber of Commerce. And Frank, thank you very much for coming here and being on the show to talk about the health and history of the Merrimack River.
Thank you very much, Dyke.
So one thing I was interested in, you're the head of the chamber. As we look back on the Christmas season, how was shopping in restaurants in Newburyport? Did you get a sense whether it was a good season?
Yeah, I thought we had a good season. One of the nice things we were able to measure, we did over $100,000 in gift cards this year.
Oh, great. Mm-hmm.
And it was really good. So it was a lot of bounce with that, a lot of people trying to shop locally. So it was really good. And I think it was a short season, 4 weeks as opposed last year we had 5. But I think there was a lot of activity and people like Santa Claus and so forth. And it was a good economic bounce.
You know, it seems like we frequently talk about the downtown, but there's several areas that have stores in them and seem to be doing well. The Route 1 Rotary, it seems like several stores have filled up there.
Yeah, we've got a little renaissance down there, and which is nice. And I think you're going to see, with the new housing put out there by Minco, you'll see some more activity where people live near the train, go into Boston. But the Rotary has its own little group, and they do a lot to promote business, and I think it's exciting. Mm-hmm. I think Pomodori has been a nice addition. He really invested heavily in the property, and it seems like it's catching on pretty good.
You know, when I was with the Daily News here in town, there was always a desire to perhaps expand the industrial park a little bit. It's been very successful. Is there talk about expanding it, or do some things need to be done, such as perhaps a transfer station or more water? Maybe you can talk about the industrial park.
One of the things that we did last week, we had our Economic Development Action Committee meeting, and one of the things they're really looking to do out there is to do some infrastructure work on some of the roads, which really kind of with trucks going over them and stuff, just to do some work there. So that's going to be a big improvement on Malcolm Hoyt Way. The mayor is committed to doing some work on Malcolm Hoyt Way. So I think that'll be a big improvement. The other thing that we've seen over the last year and a half is really a lot of corrective action in the Western Division by National Grid to really improve the capacity, the load capacity of power going out there. And they've done some work out on the Western Division run that comes in through Byfield and it goes right into the park out there through Groveland. And so I think that's a big improvement. And I think the other thing which you're going to see coming up is a lot of discussion around the zoning changes. One of the things that the city and the city council want to do is to try to keep, Graff Road and that park more park friendly and not let it get like up on Story Ave where you have, fast food restaurants and so forth. So I think those are some of the changes you're going to see. You're also going to see on the Route 1 corridor some discussion with the Impro property to try to site a hotel there. They're working with the MBTA to purchase the property where those 2 signs are. So I think that will kind of open up and give them some, people that come to do business to stay overnight.
That's kind of near Haley's Ice Cream.
Yes, right up that little corridor there.
People always talk about restaurants. We mentioned a couple have departed in the last few months. Have you heard, is there going to be a tenant where the Black Cow used to be, and I'm talking the Black Cow on the water rather than on the street?
Yeah, he's really starting to work in there this week. There's a lot of construction. They're doing some gutting, and it's going to be, as you know, the Tuscan Kitchen is up in Salem, New Hampshire. He lives over in Seabrook Beach, the owner. So he's going to have a seafood flair to it, and I think it'll be great to get that piece of property filled, and you'll have between Michael's and the Tuscan and the Black Cow, the 3 anchors pretty much up and running, and have good tenants and good lively businesses.
Now you've been, you're native of the town. You've been a city council. You've been a state rep. and of course you were sheriff for about 2 decades. How is the city evolving as you see it? Because you've been here for quite a bit, and talk a little about what you see now compared to maybe 2 or 3 decades ago.
Yeah, I like to see it evolve. I think that, Newburyport's always been a city willing to evolve and change. And so I've seen a lot, it's really the last 2 years I've been back in the city on a day-to-day basis where, a couple of decades when I was a sheriff, I'd leave town early and then come back late. But I like seeing the change and the evolve. I would like to see, one of the things we talked about at our EDAC meeting is to have some completion down on the waterfront. I think what the city has done with turning over the NRA to the parks and the waterfront trust is a good thing to bring closure to that. I think that's been kind of floating out there for a long period of time. And I think getting to see Mr. Kopp come back and work with the city council and the city to closure to his little open area that he has up there where the boats are, and there's a lot of open area. I think that would be a nice completion to the waterfront.
I think you're talking about Waterfront West.
Yeah, Waterfront West.
Initially, it was going to be about 230 condos and perhaps not a restaurant, perhaps a hotel. Where do we stand on that, Frank?
Well, we had him speak at one of the chamber breakfasts, and one of the unique things I think that where we have some new leadership at the city council, I think there's a willingness to revisit this and maybe shrink the density and the size, maybe not as many condos, and focus more on phase 1 for the hotel and a conference area where people can do some type of conferences. He talked directly about 125 keys, so somewhere between 120 125 rooms, which I think would be great. And I think for anybody to invest over $100 million in that area of property that belongs to him and to do those improvements for the city of Newburyport, I think is a big start, and I like to see that happen.
We're just about out of time, Frank, although maybe you can come back another time because you do have answers to most questions I'm interested in. But you grew up on Joppa, and the river's changed quite a bit. Did you swim in the river as a young kid, or did, the parents say, we have a dirty river here, please don't go swimming there?
What I like to say to that issue is I lived on Water Street. I grew up, I had my own boat on the river. I dug clams, I fished, swam, water skied. And one of the first things I ever talked about as a young boy at 12 years old was cleaning up the Merrimack River. And I was in 1970, it's hard to believe. And I spoke at a debate for state rep at the time. George Toomey was running against Ty Tucker, and I talked about why it's important to have clean water and clean river. And I am a little disappointed that we've kind of gone full circle again, and knowing what goes on upriver, not seeing those people be good citizens like we are in Newburyport. We've done a good job with our sewer treatment, a good job with our water. Amesbury and Salisbury has also, and I just think that they need to be directed by the state and the federal government to clean up their acts and stop discharging into the river.
I think you're referring to the fact that a lot of, when their sewage overflows upriver, Haverhill,
yes,
Lowell and Lawrence, and also in New Hampshire, can places downriver such as us prevail upon those communities, or do we have to get the state involved, as you indicated?
I think you have to get the state and the federal government involved. We can pressure them a little bit, but I really think it comes from DEP, the Secretary of Environmental Affairs, just like what we saw happen with the Charles River and Boston Harbor when I was in the legislature back in the early 90s. That's what needs to happen with Lawrence and Lowell and upriver, Nashua, because those things just shouldn't be happening. And, we pay our sewer bills, our water bills down here, and we want to see a clean river.
Right. Okay, well, this was great. Frank Cousins has been the guest. I am Dyke Hendrickson. This is Life Along the Merrimack. It's heard on radio, seen on TV, and it's on YouTube as well. Thank you, Frank, for coming down.
Thank you for having me.
We'll talk again, and we'll be here again next Tuesday at 2 o'clock when Jared Eigenman, the new president of the City Council, will be here. Thank you very much.